My name is Katie Yates, and this is Fishing Game Changers on Tap. In this series, I'm exploring the many benefits of forested land in the Sebago Lake watershed. The forest acts as a natural filter, keeping the water of Sebago Lake pristine. Sebago Lake is the main water supply for the Portland Water District, serving about 20% of Maine's population. The water quality is so good and consistent. When it arrives to taps in Portland, the breweries in the area can use the water without additional treatment, keeping the quality of their product high and costs low. In last week's episode, I learned a little about hunting, fishing, and foraging in the Sebago Lake watershed with Field to Fork foodie Dan Vitalis. He benefits from forested land in the watershed, but so do the fish and wildlife species managed by the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. In case you forgot, that's where I work. To get the lowdown on how conservation in the watershed impacts fish and wildlife species, I decided to go to the experts, the regional biologists who work in the Sebago Lake region of Maine. Jim Pellerin is a regional fisheries biologist for the Sebago Lake region. The Sebago Lake region extends from Kittery to Bethel. With a land area about the size of Connecticut, Jim and the other fishery biologists in this region have over 300 ponds and 4,000 miles of rivers, streams, and brooks to manage. A tremendous number of people live in this area of Maine, and for Jim, that translates to lots of contact with the public. Sometimes that means he's helping tourists or locals plan their fishing trips. With 24 years on the job, he's got a lot of knowledge and experience to share with anglers.
We do a lot of public, particularly down here with such a high human population, we do a lot of public education, information, and outreach. We have a lot of fish and game clubs down here. We get a lot of calls, things like that, so we do a lot of that. Mm-hmm. We get a lot of calls with the public or walk-ins, and they'll have questions about different fishing opportunities or...
So that happens pretty frequently.
That happens quite frequently.
That's interesting. That's good.
Yeah. So I usually spend, I would say I spend probably at least an hour a day, every day dealing with public outreach, information, education.
And just telling them about it.
And sometimes a lot more than that, but in general, through calls and walk-ins, at least an hour.
That's interesting. It's good that they have a resource to reach out to if they have a question or a concern, or if they're thinking about... Do you get people who are thinking about going to fish in a certain area and they just want your feedback for what's a good opportunity?
Yeah, so we get calls from out-of-state people that want to come up and they want to know, I'm coming up to the Algonquin area or Wells, and where can I go fishing for bass or for trout? Or sometimes you got to tease that out of them. Well, what kind of fishing do you want to do? Or, and they might want to know if they can run a boat or a canoe or any where they should stay and things like that. Are there any guides in the area?
So you're like a tour guide for people.
Sometimes.
With a very specific fisheries focus.
We'll get a lot of calls from people looking to buy second homes up here. And they're looking to buy on a certain water, and they'll ask us about the water quality of the lake, what's in it for fish. So again, just a whole
Talking to the public is just one piece of the multitude of work fisheries biologists do in this region.
A lot of this is monitoring, surveying, and assessing fish and fishery habitats. And that's probably the funnest part of this job. It's probably why we all get into this. But there's actually a lot more to it. We develop stocking programs. We decide, what species get stocked where, how many, time of year, size that the fish are stocked, things like that. We don't actually do the stocking. Our hatchery division does that. But we basically make the call on those types of decisions. In addition to that, we do some habitat improvement. Fisheries habitat improvement can be very expensive. A lot of what we focus on fisheries habitat as improvement down in this area is habitat connectivity, trying to restore fish passage, whether it's through highway culverts, town culverts, dam removals, things like that.
So you're just keeping waterways connected to one another.
Exactly, so fish can move where they need to move at different times of year and throughout the season.
To monitor fish populations and behavior, the fisheries biologists have a few methods. One method is rigging the fish with a small radio tag, which transmits a signal. When the biologists are ready to track down a tagged fish, they use an antenna and listen for a beeping sound. Wildlife biologists use a similar method when fitting bear, deer, and moose with radio collars. You might remember this from the episode where I visited a bear den in season 1 of this series. Of course, tracking down a sleepy bear in her den is challenging, but so is finding a speedy fish on the move.
We will go out and do some actually, I would say, more technical fishery research type stuff, whether it's telemetry type projects or...
So telemetry, you put like a GPS
Yep.
chip or something?
So telemetry would be radio tags in the fish, and then we can track them, similar to what they do with wildlife and the moose and things like the bear. A little harder with fish, but
yeah,
it's
I was just going to
doable.
ask, what do you do then? You walk around and try and find, you approximate where you think they're going to be? And
So you can either do it by... Fish can move a lot, so it kind of depends. Sometimes you can do it by boat, sometimes you can do it from the shore. A lot of times we will, because in watersheds that are large and kind of interconnected, and fish may be in very different places at different times of the year, a lot of times we need to use aircraft so we can cover a lot of ground.
Do you get in a helicopter or plane?
Plane, usually.
Wow.
Usually our warden service will fly for us and do those.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so it's pretty neat.
Fisheries biologists also work with private landowners to ensure the public has access to fishing and boating opportunities on Maine's lakes, rivers, and streams. Most of Maine is privately owned. Generous landowners allow hunters, anglers, boaters, ATV and snowmobile riders, and many others access to important outdoor resources. Fisheries biologists also work to cut down on invasive species, which can outcompete coveted native species such as brook trout. Another facet of fisheries biologists' work is helping to set regulations on size and bag limits, the type of things anglers find in our fishing law book. After hearing all this, I'm curious about Jim's thoughts on Sebago Lake specifically. I wonder how the quality of the water and forested watershed of Maine's deepest lake impact the fishery.
Yep. So Sebago Lake is, it's the second largest lake in the state of Maine, so it is pretty important. It's a major water supply for all, a good portion of southern Maine, and so it is pretty important water. It has, for cold water fisheries, the principal fisheries would be landlocked Atlantic salmon and lake trout. The landlocked Atlantic salmon were native to that system, so one of only 4 in the whole state of Maine. So,
wow.
So historically and genetically, it's a pretty important population of fish. And then it's got a whole variety of warm water fisheries, some that were there and some that have been illegally introduced.
Before we dive in further, I have Jim clarify the difference between cold water and warm water fish species.
Cold water fish typically need temperatures, they need water somewhere in that system, preferably below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and they need oxygen levels above 5 parts per million dissolved oxygen in the water. And when you start getting out of that range, it becomes unsuitable for them. Mm-hmm. And warm water usually can tolerate quite warm temperatures, usually up into the mid-80s, no problem. And some species, most species still need some better dissolved oxygen, but they can usually go lower than 5 parts per million and do just fine.
So I'm guessing because of Sebago Lake's size and depth, that's why it can stay so cold and oxygenated. It doesn't have algae blooms the way that other smaller lakes or ponds might.
Yeah. Partially because it's so big, and also the watershed protection that's been there has really helped it.
Earlier this season, Laurel Jackson from the Portland Water District explained how forested land acts as a filter for Sebago Lake. Forested watersheds offer many benefits. They prevent runoff and erosion, which would result in unwanted sediment in the lake. They help keep unwanted contaminants out of the water and can even help keep water temperatures consistent. The forested watershed and water quality of Sebago Lake are the perfect recipe for Maine's iconic landlocked salmon. Sebago Lake is 30,513 acres, so pretty big. The water quality is exceptional, and the lake supports a large volume of cold, oxygenated water, and that means cold water species like salmon can thrive. Sebago Lake and the Crooked River, which you'll hear more about later, are home to one of only 4 indigenous salmon populations in the state of Maine, making them historically and genetically important. Wild salmon spawn in lake outlets or inlets from mid-October to late November. Young wild salmon spend 1 to 4 years in a stream environment before migrating to a lake.
That salmon fishery has gone up and down. Sometimes it's been good. Sometimes it's been bad. We almost lost it a couple times back in the 60s, we almost lost the salmon population due to DDT spraying on the lake.
Oh, wow.
Fisheries biologists came from this department, actually this region, determined that was the cause of the decline, and basically fought very hard. This was during the Rachel Carson era, and they fought very hard to get people to stop spraying DDT voluntarily around the lake, and eventually that fishery came back and got better. So
Rachel Carson made waves with her book Silent Spring and is credited with progressing the global environmental movement. If you didn't read Silent Spring in high school like I did, it focuses on documenting the adverse environmental effects of pesticides. DDT, a pesticide mostly used after World War II, had devastating effects on wildlife, most notably, perhaps, on eagles, which made a comeback in Maine, like landlocked salmon in Sebago Lake. But DDT is not the only threat the Sebago Lake salmon have seen. Historically, landlocked salmon have had their struggles, but today 80% of salmon in Sebago Lake are wild. Fisheries biologists keep a close eye on salmon populations, not just in Sebago Lake, but also the Crooked River, the primary nursery stream.
Originally it was all wild back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Couldn't withstand the fishing pressure and the popularity that came in the early 1930s. The department started stocking the lake, and it kind of went from a completely wild fishery to almost an entirely stocked fishery. And through a lot of work from my predecessors and myself, we've eventually, the lake is now producing 80% of the salmon coming out of there are now wild again.
Wow.
And a lot of that was through habitat connectivity on the main spawning stream, which is the Crooked River. So we've got that wild salmon fishery has kind of come back. So it's kind of a real success story with the lake. So we do a lot of work on the salmon in terms of monitoring them. We monitor them every year. And we do a lot of work on the Crooked River, which is the primary nursery stream, where we trap the wild salmon coming up because we had very little data on the wild fish. And we put pit tags in those so we could track their movement up and downstream. We're still analyzing some of that data.
What tags do you put on them?
So in the salmon, we put in pit tags, which are a little tag. It has no battery, so it has a long lifespan. And what you do is you set up antennas at different places in the river. When the fish swim through it, it marks that fish has a unique ID, like a social security number. So you know that fish went by that antenna on X date at X time.
Oh, cool.
And so we'd put like five antennas on the river, up and down the river during the spawning season, so we could see how they were traveling, how fast they were traveling, see when they were dropping back out of the river, and things like that.
The breweries and residents in Portland benefit from Sebago Lake's clean water. Sportsmen like Dan benefit from access to forested land in the watershed. How does Sebago Lake's pristine water impact the work Jim Pellerin does for the department?
Again, water quality is pretty important for us. A lot of times we look at water quality in terms of, does it have cold oxygenated water to support cold water fisheries? And Sebago has a ton of it. And a lot of, some lakes in our region have either lost the water quality, what happened, they kind of eutrophy, or they get algae blooms and the oxygen gets used up and deprived. So when that process happens, we've had some lakes in southern Maine where we've either had to change our management of species, and in some waters we probably have no longer been able to manage for cold water species. You have to go to warm water species that are less, that are more tolerant of those types of conditions.
The story of landlocked salmon and Sebago's clean water is bigger than simply the forested watershed. Fish and wildlife depend on vast swatches of interconnected protected habitat. Without that, populations could see significant impacts. Or there's an increased likelihood of human-wildlife interactions. Jim points out that the forested watershed for Sebago Lake is great, but that species like salmon also depend on a forested buffer around the Crooked River.
Well, just being forced to reduces like sedimentation, siltation in the watershed, which is then is important for spawning. Make sure they have clean gravel for spawning and protecting the crooked river drainage. So the crooked river is, I would say it's marginal cold water habitat. So that, maintaining that forested buffers and everything, that whole crooked river drainage, which is the primary spawning for the salmon, is really important to keep that from going over the edge and no longer being suitable for salmon.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's not just looking at the lake, but looking at all of the water bodies that feed into the lake and those ecosystems too. So interconnectedness.
Yep.
In next week's episode, I talk to wildlife biologist Scott Lindsay about habitat and endangered species in the watershed and beyond. Then I promise I'll head back to Portland for another brewery visit. To learn more about this series, you can visit mefishwildlife.com/changers. And to stay up to date on current episodes, hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.